Today we're going to rebuild Vercel's animated navigation tabs using React, Tailwind CSS, FramerMotion, and TypeScript. Don't worry if you aren't a Tailwind or TypeScript person, this should be pretty easy to follow without them. This will allow us to hover over a tab and see the tab icon animate. It'll fade in and out the drop-down menu and animate the content that's within the drop-down menu directionally, depending on which tab we hover over next. All of this code can be found on my website in both JavaScript and TypeScript, along with a whole bunch of other cool animated UI components built specifically for React, Tailwind CSS, and FramerMotion. Anyways, let's get started. To start, let's take a quick look at what I've already got here. Up at the top, I've got this main wrapping component. This has no actual logic in it we need to worry about. It's just a div with some basic styles on it to actually position our nav. Position flex, height of 96, which is 384 pixels, with the full justify start, giving it some background color and some text color. And then whenever we're at a medium-sized screen, we're just justifying it to the center. So nothing fancy here. You can do this however you want. And then inside of that, I just have this basic tabs component where we're going to hold the majority of our logic. And then below that, I'm actually defining the content for our tabs. So I just have this basic little hello world component. Later, we'll change this to actually be content that makes sense for each tab. This could be whatever you want, but I'm just going to leave it with this for now so that we have an easy starting point. In my tabs array right here, I'm defining what is going to be the title for each one of our tabs, and then the component that we actually want to render whenever we're hovering over that tab. So whenever we hover over the products tab, so the tab with the title of products, we want to render this component. Pricing, we want to render this component. Blog, we want to render this component. And then I'm just automatically generating some IDs with this little map function that I have here. This is the exact same thing as saying ID 1 and then ID 2, etc., etc. For this specific example, we just want to make sure that our IDs are numbers and that they're increasing in value. We'll see why in a little bit, but because of that, it's just a little bit easier to automatically generate our IDs like this. I'm going to close up a couple of these components so we can subtract this and subtract this. And we're just going to start right here in our tabs component. We're going to need two pieces of state to actually make this work. And that's starting with a piece of state, which I'm calling selected. We need to make sure we actually import use state. Obviously, if you're not using TypeScript like I am, you can ignore the number null typing thing right here like this. But essentially what this is going to do is tell us which of the tabs down here that we have selected. So remember that I'm saying that each ID is just a number. So whenever we're hovering over number 1 or tab number 1, it will be 1, else 2, else 3. And if we're not actually hovering over anything, it's just going to be null. I then also need a piece of state, which I'm calling dir for direction. And that's either going to be null, the string L, or the string R, which means left or right. And this is going to help us figure out which direction we actually want to translate our content. So by example, if I started hovering over products and then I start hovering over pricing, I'm moving to the right, in which case I want to exit with the products component to the left, and the pricing component should come in from the right side, and then vice versa if you're going in the other direction. To make that hopefully make a little bit more sense, we can start by defining a function right here, which I'm going to call handle set selected, and this is just going to take in a value, which either is going to be number or null, and this is actually going to handle setting both our selected and our direction state, and this is just going to have a relatively straightforward if condition inside of it. So we're going to say if the type of whatever selected is a number, and the type of whatever the current value is a number, then that means that we can compare those two numbers together, aka we're going from hovering one tab to hovering another tab, so we can set the direction accordingly. So I'm going to say set direction if selected is greater than the value that's actually being passed in. That means we want to move to the right, else we want to move to the left. If the value happens to be null, that means that we're moving our mouse off of a tab, then we just want to set our direction back to null. And then finally, we can set selected to whatever the actual value is. Now we're going to call this function whenever we actually hover over our tabs, but we also need to nullify it whenever we move outside of our tabs. And I'm just going to do that while we're still here because it's a little easier than jumping around later. So I'm going to come on our wrapping div right here, and I'm going to paste in this on mouse leave call. So I'm saying that anytime our mouse leaves this wrapping div, I want to handle set selected and set the value back to null. Now this wrapping div right here is what's going to be housing all of our tab components and everything. So I'm going to drop our styles on here as well. It needs a position of relative, a display of flex, a height of fit, and a gap of 2 between each of our individual tabs. The relative positioning is because the actual content that we're going to be rendering is going to be absolutely positioned to this outside div. I will also note now, we'll see this a little bit more as we get into it, but our tabs are actually going to be separated from our content. So what I mean by that is if I come into my div right here, I'm going to add a little to do and say render all of our tabs, and then another to do down here that says render our content. So it's not that each of our tabs are then inside of themselves going to have our content. We're actually just going to have one wrapping component that renders all of our content, and then we're just going to move the actual content that's inside of it in and out based on which tab we're currently hovering. Again, that may be a little bit confusing, so let's just step through this one piece at a time, starting with actually rendering these tabs. I can remove my to-do right here, and we can get started with that. I'm going to start by actually mapping over all of my tabs like this. Inside of the callback function inside of map, I'm just going to return a component that I'm going to call tab. We haven't defined this yet. We'll define it in just a second. And this is going to take in a number of props. Obviously, this is going to need our key prop per usual. We can just call it t.id. I'm also going to pass it in the value that we currently have for this piece of state, which we're calling selected. I'll pass it in our handle selected function, which we just defined above. And then finally, I'll pass in the ID for our tab, which I'm just calling that tab. So tab equals t.id. Of course, we now actually need to define this component. So I'm going to come down under my content component up here. We can then create our basic tab component like this. It's going to take in a number of props. So it's going to take in props.children, tab, handle set selected, and selected, as we saw up here. The types for those, if you're using TypeScript, can look something like this. So React node, I have to remember to actually import that. The tab is going to be a number because that's just the ID of the tab. Handle set selected is a function with a type that looks something like this. And then selected is either a number or null. Now for the content of this is actually going to return a button. And let's just start by actually rendering something in here. So inside of my button, I'm going to render a span with children as the text. If I scroll up, react.children, I actually forgot to add to my tab in here. So let's do that really quick. The actual children prop for each of these should just be t.title like this, and that will render the title for each of our button tabs into the span right here. Saving that, we should see that we're now actually rendering each of our tab components. They have a little bit of gap because we used flex and then added some gap between them. I added this in a span because I also want to add an icon next to this. I'm using the React icon package, and I know that I want to use an icon called FI chevron down. So that is now being imported from React icons. Looks like this. If you want to use the same icons, you can just install the React icons package and you'll get all of these icons. Scroll back down here to where I just was a moment ago. And if I save that, we should now have our icons as well. So I'm going to add these class names actually as a string literal like this. And the base stylings are going to be group. This is a Tailwind style. This is just going to let us change some of these styles within this button based on this outside group. Also add a display of flex, item center, a gap of 1, which is 4 pixels, rounded full to completely round the corners. Padding on the x-axis of 3 or 12 pixels, on the y-axis of 1.5 or 6 pixels, setting a text of small, and transition to colors. If I save this, we should now see that everything is laid out as we want it to be. But we also have a couple of other styles that we want to add conditionally based on which tab is actually currently selected. So I'll add those in really quick as well by opening up my brackets like this inside of my string literal. And I'll say that if the currently selected tab is equal to this tab, then I want to add these styles, else I want to add these styles. So if the tab is selected, I want a background of neutral 800 and a text of neutral 100. Else I want a text of neutral 400. We want something similar for our chevron icon right here. Let me close this up. So I'll add a couple of spaces right here and drop my class names in. All that I'm saying here is to transition on transform, and then if the selected tab is the current tab again, then I want to rotate 180 degrees, else I don't want to rotate at all. I'm also realizing that I actually don't need this group. I probably did this based on a group earlier and then decided against it. So I'll just remove that group from right there, and I think that should still work. Now, obviously, this isn't doing anything for me right now because I'm not changing my selected value, so we can set that up really quick. All that I'm going to do is I'm going to say on my button, whenever I actually mouse over this button, I want to handle set selected to whatever that tab is. Now we should see that this works as I mouse around, and also as I leave, it should go away because remember we added that on mouse leave up on the div above. I also want to remember that some people are probably doing this on mobile. So I want to do the same thing on click. To do that, I'll just come directly under my on mouse enter and also add an on click, which just calls the same function the same way. And we're not actually going to really be able to see any difference, but we should now know that whenever we click on any of these buttons, it's going to open as well on mobile. Now there's one extra tiny little thing that we need to do here, which we're not actually going to see the point of until we get to moving around that little nub piece. We won't go too deep into explaining exactly why we're doing this until we get to that. But all that I'm going to do is I'm going to set a unique ID for each of my tabs, which I'm going to call shift tab, and then whatever the actual tab is. We're doing this so that we can fetch this later by just get element by ID. And that should actually be everything that we need for our tab. So I can come up here and close my tab up. Now, before I move any further, I'm gonna come up and I'm actually gonna set selected to the number 1 instead of null, just because it's gonna be a little bit easier to actually see what we're doing here when this is 1 instead of null and having to hover over it every single time. I'll collapse my tabs, and it's time to actually start rendering our content under our tabs whenever we hover over them. I will delete my comment that I have right here. And I will say that if I have a value for selected, then I want to actually render my content. Remember, this is only happening whenever I'm actually hovering over a tab. I will call the content for that content, and I'm going to pass in both the direction and the currently selected tab. And I'm going to want to use some exit animations for this using framer motion. So to be able to do that, we need to wrap this call in another function called, or another component rather, called animate presence. So we just need to make sure that we import that from framer motion up here at the top, just like this. And then we can actually define our content component down here, let's say below our tab component. So basic component here, it then needs a couple of props passed in. Those are called selected and direction, and the types for those are number and null for selected and null left or right for direction. This is going to return a motion, a motion.div. Not sure if we've actually imported motion yet. Looks like we haven't, so I can scroll back up to the top where I have animate presence and just import motion from framer motion. And then if I just give this any styling really quick, we should see that this is rendering. So we'll just say class name, width 24, height 24, BG, red 500, something like that. And we now see that we're actually rendering something. Obviously, this is not where we actually want to be doing this, but we're only going to render it whenever selected has a value. So as I mouse around on these, it's going to keep rendering. And then as I move my mouse off, it is no longer rendering. If I refresh, we're defaulting selected to 1, so it's going to show up like this. Now there's a fair number of styles that I actually want to use, and they are not these ones, obviously. So let's give ourselves some space here. And I'm just going to drop these in and we'll walk over them. So first I want a position of absolute because we're going to absolutely position this below our tabs. I'm going to set it with a left of 0 so that it lines up on the left side of my tabs. I'll give it a top of 100% plus an extra 24 pixels. I want to know how long or how far the distance is between my tabs and my actual content. So now we know it's 24 pixels, giving it a static width of 96, which is 384 pixels. Rounded large, giving it a 1 pixel border of neutral 600, giving a background gradient to the bottom from neutral 900 via neutral 900 to neutral 800. This is just going to mean that we're only going to have that gradient really on the bottom half of our box. And then I'm going to give it a padding of 4. If I save that and refresh, we should now have a box down on the very bottom. There we go. Yeah, floating right below all of our tabs. Up above my class name here, I have one other ID that I actually want to add to this div as well. Similarly to the last ID that we added, we'll actually walk through kind of the purpose of these when we get to the nub section, but for right now, just add an ID of overlay content. And then I also want to animate this in and out whenever we mouse over a tab and whenever we mouse out of a tab. So to do that using framer motion is going to look something like this. First, we need to define the initial state of our component. So I'm going to say an opacity of 0 and a Y transform of 8 pixels. And whenever this appears, I want it to animate from that value to an opacity of 1 and a Y translate of 0. Then whenever it exits, I want it to go back to where it started. So back to an opacity of 0 and a Y translate of 8. If I save this, we should now see that whenever I hover over this, whenever I first hover over it, it actually animates in and then it animates out whenever it goes away. Now, one thing that we're going to notice, which I don't like, is whenever I try and actually mouse my mouse between here and the content, it goes away. That's because there's a kind of an empty void here between the tabs and where the actual content lives. And we're going to need some kind of a bridge to fix that because where the actual, let's go up here, where the mouse leave function is being called, obviously there's no content in between the tabs and the actual content that we're rendering. So this is technically a mouse leave, right? It's not hovering over any actual content here anymore. In order to fix that, I'm going to create a component which I'm going to render inside of my div right here, and I'm just going to call that bridge. So we'll just say bridge like this. And the bridge component is literally just going to be a basic div. I'll just come and drop that right here. It'll just be a basic div with a position of absolute, a top or a minus top of 24 pixels, a height of 24 pixels. Remember, this 24 pixels is the same 24 pixels as why I defined it right here. I need to know how far between my tabs and my content, or how far between my tabs and my content, like what that value is. For me, it's 24 pixels. So I can do something like this, absolute position, top 24, left and right of 0 to make sure it's the full width of this content, and then a height of 24 pixels. And this should now give me a bridge between my tabs and my content so that I can actually mouse between them like this. See what I'm saying? So I don't actually lose my content whenever I try to go between one tab and another. Only when I actually mouse out will it go away. But that's not particularly exciting. We're obviously still not rendering our actual content, so let's get to that piece. Now remember when I said that I want to actually render all of our content, not just kind of one at a time, tied to the tab? Well, here's kind of what I meant by that. So I'm going to start by mapping over all of our tabs like this. And this can just return a basic outer div, which is going to wrap the main content. This can have an overflow of hidden so that whenever we do the translate to the content inside of it, it's not visible. And then just a key of the ID of the tab. And then inside each of these, I only want to render the actual content if the selected ID is equal to the current tab's ID. That way, if we don't actually have the selected ID in here, we're just going to render these empty divs, which is totally fine. It's not going to take up any space. But if they are selected, then I want to render a motion div so that we can animate it in and out. The initial position for these is actually going to change based on our direction. So that's kind of where the direction thing is coming into play here. I'll start it with an opacity of 0. Then I'm going to translate it on the x-axis, again, based on the direction. So if the direction is left, I want to start with an x-translate of 100%. Else, if it's right, I want to start with an x-translate of -100. Or if it's null, it can just be 0. We actually don't need to do an x-translate whenever we go from null to some actual selected tab, if that makes sense. Now, the actual animate prop is going to be the same every time. So we just want to animate this to an x of 0 and an opacity of 1. And then finally, we can define a transition for this. I'm adding a duration of 0.25 seconds and an ease of ease in out. Now, we're not actually going to see anything yet because we're not actually rendering anything in there. So the last little thing that we need to do is just actually render the component that is tied to our tab. So remember, right now, these are just the same little example component that is rendering hello world. But that should at least let us see this kind of movement that we have here. So if I save this, then hover over any of these tabs, we should see them kind of starting to do what we're expecting them to do. So as I move to the right, it goes out to the left and in from the right. And then as we go from right to left, it goes out to the right and in from the left. That was a serious mouthful, but I think you see what I'm getting at here. But there is still one kind of fine detail that I still want to get in here, and that's that little nub animation. So I want to have a little nub that kind of lives right on top of this content box and moves around, animates around based on which component or which tab that I'm currently hovering over. So under my bridge, I'm going to add one more component, which I am going to call nub. And this is going to take in the selected value. So selected is equal to selected. And then we can just come down here and actually define that component. So we will create our nub component that will take in selected, and selected is either a number or null. And selected is going to return just a motion.span element. Our span element will have a number of styles on here. So I'll drop these in. First, it needs a position of absolute. Then it needs a left of 50% and a top of 0. This is going to live on the top of our content box. I'm giving it a width and a height of 16 pixels or 4 like this. This can be any value you want, just depending on how big you want your little nub thing to be. Then I'm translating it back 50% on the x-axis to actually center it, and on the y-axis to actually bump it up above the top of my box. I'm rotating it 45 degrees because by default, this is just a little square. And then I'm rounding the top left corner, just the top left corner, we'll see why in just a second, by 4 pixels, and then adding a border and some background. Now, if I save this, we should just see that we have a little box up here at the top. And obviously that is not exactly what we want. I don't want this actually leaking down like this. So we can actually use a clip path to get rid of this little bottom piece. And that clip path is going to look something like this. So clip path, we want to clip a polygon. And I'm not going to pretend like I ever do my clip paths automatically. I normally use a tool called Clippy, which I will drop a link to in the description if you want to actually be able to play around with clip paths. It's kind of annoying to try and do in your head. A lot easier to just use a tool to figure out how you need to slice something. So in this case, I just needed to slice the bottom right corner off, and that should look something like that. So now we have our little nub. It's just a nub. It's not leaking down into the bottom of the content, and it has a little bump up there at the top. Now I'm setting this left to 1/2 by default, but this is actually the value that we need to animate. So anytime I move between one and another tab, we want to move its left position to actually be centered with wherever that nub is. So up at the top above my return, I'm going to create a new piece of state. Create a new piece of state, which I'm just going to call left. It's just going to be a use state with a value of 0. And I'm also going to add a ref, which I'm going to add to this span. So I'll say nub ref, and that's equal to use ref. We need to make sure we import that from React. If you're using TypeScript, that's either going to be null or an HTML span element. We can define that as null to start, and then we'll just actually add that to our span. So I'll say ref is equal to nubref like this. Now really what we need to do here is we need to actually move this element anytime we either hover this the first time or move between different elements, which really just means that anytime the value for selected here changes, then we need to move our nub. And an easy way to do that is just with a side effect using useEffect. So I'm going to import useEffect from React. I'm going to take a callback function like this, and I want this function to run anytime the value for selected changes. Inside of my callback here, I want to call a function, which I'm going to call moveNub. Oops, moveNub like this. And then obviously we need to actually define that. So I'll say const moveNub is equal to something like this. And we can actually define our logic down here for translating our nub around. Now, if selected is null, we don't actually need to do anything. So I'll say only if selected, then we actually want to, do things. In order to figure out where we actually need to move our element to, we need to start by grabbing a couple of references to some of the other elements that we have in our layout here. First and foremost, we need a reference to whichever tab we're actually hovering. So I'm going to define a variable which I'll call hovered tab. That is going to be equal to document.getElementById, and we're going to grab whichever element has a shift tab ID equal to whatever the selected element is. Remember we set that earlier, and I was kind of like, hey, I'll explain this later. That's up here on the tab. So each of our tabs has this unique ID that is equal to the selected tab. So that is the reference that we're grabbing right here. We then need to also grab a reference to the overlay content. So that I also added an ID to earlier. That is up here. So on our wrapping div for our content right here, we have a reference to our overlay content. And we can use these values kind of compared together to figure out where to actually translate our little nub to. So back down in my moveNub function, I'm just going to grab that other reference. All that I need to do that is something like this. So I'll say overlay content is document.getElementById. Overlay content, it's only ever one ID. This is not like a changing thing. You're not trying to actually grab the inside content. You just need that wrapping div. So this is totally fine as is. If you're using TypeScript like me, you're going to need to also add a little guard condition here. You're going to get yelled at. So I'm going to say if the hovered tab, or if there's not a hovered tab, or there's not any overlay content, or the nub ref does not currently actually have a reference to it. So that's the ref that we added up here. Then there's nothing we can do. We should just return. And if not, we can actually get to our logic down here. So what we need to do is we need to get the bounding rectangles around each of these elements. So we need to get the bounding rectangle both around whatever our hovered tab is. So that would be like the rectangle that goes around kind of this pill looking thing right here, or this one right here. And then we also need to get the bounding rectangle around our wrapping content right here. I'll start by getting the bounding client rect for my tab. I'll call it tab rect, and that is equal to hovered tab.getBoundingClientRect. This is going to return you a bunch of different information about like the top and left and the position of the element on the page, essentially. And we're going to need the same thing for the overlay content. We actually specifically only need one piece of it. And by specifically one piece of it, we just need the left value for this. I'm actually going to cast this to a variable called content left. That is equal to overlay content.getBoundingClientRect like this. And with this information, we can actually calculate the center of where our nub is supposed to be. So that is going to look something like this. We'll say tab center is equal to our tab rectangle's left value plus the tab rectangle's width. So if you look up here, we need to know the left value, so over here, and then the width of the full box. And we'll divide that value by 2 because we actually just want the middle value, like right in the middle of the tab. And then subtract the content left value from that. So content left would be the left value like right here. I'm also realizing as I'm doing this that I don't think I needed this reference to the nub. That might have been just left in there from when I first made this. So yeah, let me double check that in a second, but I think we can actually get rid of this nub ref right here. But before we do that, let's actually make this work. So now we have the center of our tab, and all that we need to do is set our left value to whatever that tab center is, and then make sure that we're actually using this. So I'll take my left value right here, come down to my motion span, and set animate is equal to left like this. This should work as is. Yep, we're animating. Our tab is moving between each of these little tabs as I move it around. We can then also adjust the easing if we want. If we want it to be the same easing as we're using elsewhere, it will look something like this. So a duration of 0.25 seconds and an ease of ease in out. Now, before I go crazy, let me see if I can actually remove this nub ref. I'm 99% sure that I can. Delete that. and delete my nubref like this. Let's see, does that still work or do things explode? No, that's what I thought. Cool, so you didn't need that ref, apology. What I assume I was doing originally when I first made this little demo was just manually adjusting the nubref style as opposed to using this left position like this, and I probably just left that in there, but it will not be in the source code whenever you go to download this, don't worry. But anyways, that is it. Let's make this a little bit bigger. We now see that this is centered because we had that kind of adjusting style there. As I move this around, everything moves around. We can add some more exciting content to this really quick. I don't want to walk through that because it's not super exciting, but I can drop some in and just show you guys what that looks like. So I have a couple of components here that I built earlier. I'll remove my example component right here and just drop these in. These are going to need a couple of imports. So let me do that really quick. Cool. Then we can take these components and actually use them. So the products component for products, pricing for pricing, blog for blog, and let's see what those look like. Again, you can get all these on my website. There we go. Nice. But I don't want to just make you guys walk through me building, some basic CSS stuff. Not super exciting building these pieces of components. But yeah, so that's pretty much it. We've got our nub moving around. As I move my mouse around, everything actually changes. If I move my mouse off, it goes away, back on, comes back in. And this is pretty much it. Again, you can grab all the code for this on my website under components, and then I think it's under links. Yeah, so it should be the top value under, or the top component under links. Again, I have a couple of little oopsies in there that I'll make sure that I remove before I actually post this video. But yeah, hope this helped. See you guys next time. Peace.